December 16th, 1944. American troops in the freezing cold await a jolly Christmas season. But suddenly, the Ardennes forest is flooded with German tanks, artillery, and infantry. The Germans have just launched their last major offensive on the Western Front. But why did the Germans think launching an offensive was a good idea, and why did it ultimately break them? Although the Allies had landed on the European continent and were pushing the Germans out of France, Hitler believed that if Germany could just win one final offensive, the tide could change and force negotiations for a separate peace deal with just the Americans and British. And with the Western Front at peace, the Germans could focus their resources on their biggest enemy, the Soviet Union. Since Germany was in a weak defensive position, negotiations were unlikely to happen. So, the German High Command came up with a plan. Well, not really a new plan, they basically just copied what worked for them during the fall of France in 1940. Similar to their plan in 1940, they intended to launch a massive offensive through the Ardennes, encircling the British at the coast and splitting the Allied forces in two. Additionally, they planned to capture the valuable supply port city of Antwerp. Although a decent plan on paper, Hitler completely misread the situation. The German military was simply in no shape for an offensive this late into the war. In 1940, the Germans had air superiority, fuel, and momentum. In 1944, the Red Army in the east had advanced hundreds of miles, destroying hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of tanks and aircraft, while the Americans and British had unleashed a massive strategic bombing campaign on German soil, crippling their oil production, railways, and aircraft and tank output. German manpower was extremely weak as well, with the age of conscription being lowered and raised. So if the German generals and marshals knew this, why did they go ahead with it anyway? Well, a few factors are involved. For one, the Allies actually weren't in the best of shape either. Despite liberating France extremely quickly, their gains had heavily fatigued their army, and made their supply lines pretty stretched out. Additionally, the Allied generals generally did not think a German offensive would happen, giving the Germans the element of surprise. But the biggest reason no one spoke out was because High Command at the time either followed Hitler's word to a T, or simply too afraid to speak out. In fact, many in High Command did not have any faith in the operation. This plan hasn't got a damned leg to stand on. The whole operation has less than a 10% chance of success. The forces available for Watch on the Rhine are extremely weak in comparison to the enemy. I have grave doubts whether it would be possible to hold the ground won, unless the enemy is completely destroyed. Ultimately, Operation Watch on the Rhine went ahead on December 16th, 1944. The Allies, not prepared for a German assault, got a harsh reality check with over 200,000 soldiers and over 1,000 tanks and assault vehicles pounding their lines. Despite the German shortcomings, the initial German offensive actually did not go too bad for them. The American troops in the Ardennes region were either new and inexperienced, or were resting from 6 months of battle in France. So the Germans actually were able to push back the Allied forces, creating a bulge in their lines, which is how the battle got the name. Many Allied troops were encircled by the Germans, and at this point, many Germans actually believed that they had turned the tide around, with one soldier writing, "I think the war in the West is again turning." However, their successes would not last long. The poor weather early on had concealed German troop movements, and prevented the Allies from using their superior aircraft to send in paratroopers, unleash bombing raids, and scout positions. So, when the weather eventually cleared, the Allied Air Force was able to once again completely overwhelm the German forces. Since Germany designed the entire offensive around stealing Allied fuel, when small, mostly American units were able to halt or slow the German advances, they could not keep up with their strict schedule. After just a few days, the 80,000 Americans in the Ardennes had been backed up by almost 500,000 Allied troops. Since the Germans did not gain enough territory fast enough, they couldn't take Allied fuel, so they were not able to continue their offensive. Eventually, the Allies began a counterattack. Famously, General George S. Patton was able to relieve the Americans at Bastogne. With the Bulge turning into a battle of attrition, there was ever only going to be one clear winner, the logistical juggernaut of the Allied forces. By the end of January, the Bulge had closed up, Germany's gamble had faltered, and hopes of a separate peace were gone. Although the Germans did inflict heavy losses on the Allies, the casualties the Germans received were much more devastating to their cause. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945, Germany had lost between 80,000 and 100,000 men, including around 15,000 killed, many of whom were their most experienced veteran troops. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned, over 2,000 vehicles were lost, and the Luftwaffe lost a few hundred aircraft. Even worse, Germany had burned through their final fuel reserves. The elite panzer formations destroyed in the Ardennes would never be rebuilt, and the divisions pulled from other fronts made it easier for the Red Army's final surge towards Berlin. After the Battle of the Bulge, Germany never again launched a major offensive on the Western Front, and just 4 months later, Germany unconditionally surrendered.